This was François Tombalbaye, the former president of the nation of Chad and one of the most strange dictators the continent has ever had. When he was at the helm, Tombalbaye put in place some strange policies which raised quite a few eyebrows and led to a disgruntled populace in Chad. For instance, he ordered all high government officials, civil servants and military officers to undergo a tradition called Yondo, which was a sometimes fatal initiation ritual. The Yondo ordeal, which Tombalbaye himself underwent as an adolescent, is known to involve flogging, facial scarring, drugging and mock burials. Within 5 years of having taken office in 1960, Tombalbaye's heavy-handed approach and repressive regime had alienated a large segment of the population, especially northerners and easterners, and had spurred rebellions across the country of Chad. François Tombalbaye was born in Beseda in southern Chad on the 15th of June 1918. His father was a prominent trader and he was one of the Sara ethnic group, the prominent ethnicity of Chad's 5 southern prefectures. Very little is known about his childhood except that he received primary education in Chad and then went on to receive his secondary education in Congo-Brazzaville. The young François studied to become a teacher also in Congo-Brazzaville due to the lack of in-country schools in Chad. It was while working as a teacher in the late 1940s that he developed an interest in civic life. By 1946, Tombalbaye had become the president of an independent trade union based in Sara, Chad. He was also instrumental in forming a chapter of the Chadian Progressive Party, the PPT, in Sar and rallied members of his clan and other Sara speakers to the party. The PPT had been formed to fight for independence in Chad, which at the time was a French colony. The leader of the PPT at the time was a man by the name Gabriel Lisette, who was an expatriate French citizen born and educated in Panama. Lisette's story and background was quite a peculiar one. He became a French colonial administrator and in this role was posted to Chad in 1946. In November of the same year, Lisette was elected as deputy to the French National Assembly. It was in February of 1947 that Gabriel Lisette founded the PPT, which was the country's first African political party. Now back to François Tombalbaye. François was quite effective in mobilizing the anti-colonial movement in Chad, and so in 1949 the French administration responded to these political activities by stripping him of his job as a teacher in public service. He had to look for other jobs and at some point he worked as a brickmaker. Despite this discrimination that he faced from the French colonial authorities because of his activism, Tombalbaye was elected as a deputy in the Colonial Territorial Assembly in 1952 and re-elected in 1957 and again in 1959. At the same time, within the PPT, antagonism towards Gabriel Lisette because of his background as a foreigner started growing, and so the leadership of the organization was transferred to François Tombalbaye. After ousting Gabriel Lisette as the leader of the PPT, Tombalbaye assumed the presidency of the Provisional Government of Chad in March of 1959 and in June of the same year was chosen as Prime Minister of the newly elected Legislative Assembly. Gabriel Lisette, whose wings had been clipped, became the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of economic coordination and foreign affairs. Now at the helm, François Tombalbaye soon consolidated enough support from the south and north to isolate the opposition into a collection of conservative Muslim leaders from central Chad. The latter group would form a political party in January of 1960, but its parliamentary representation steadily dropped as François Tombalbaye wooed individual members to the PPT. On August 11, 1960, François Tombalbaye became the first president of independent Chad. Independence brought many challenges to the new Chadian government. Chad was a vast nation with diverse territory and few natural resources. The communication and transport networks were poorly developed, and the country's population was impoverished and also ethnically diverse. The colonial powers that had created the country's boundaries had done little to promote economic interdependence, political cooperation, or cross-cultural understanding amongst the various groups in Chad. The northern part of the country was Muslim and heavily influenced by North African culture, while the southern part practiced traditional religions or Christianity with cultural ties to coastal colonies like Nigeria and the Ivory Coast. These were all the complexities that the new leader, François Tombalbaye, had to deal with. Unfortunately, the people of Chad who had hoped that the country's first president might turn out to be a state builder were soon disappointed. Chad under François Tombalbaye experienced worsening economic conditions as well as exacerbation of ethnic and regional conflicts. François Tombalbaye's government was also dominated mostly by the Southerners, and this in turn created friction with the northern part of the country. All of this was only made worse by his autocratic style of leadership. From the onset, François Tombalbaye demonstrated an autocratic style along with the distrust of democratic institutions. For example, 1 week before the country gained independence, Tombalbaye purged Gabriel Lisette from his own party, declaring Gabriel Lisette a non-citizen while he was traveling abroad and barred him from returning to Chad. This incident was the first in an excessive series of Tombalbaye's increasingly authoritarian actions to eliminate or neutralize his opponents. To increase his power as well as his freedom of action, Tombalbaye declared a ban on all political parties except for his PPT. When serious rioting occurred in 1963 in N'Djamena and a city called Amtiman, the government declared a state of emergency and dissolved the National Assembly. And as part of a major campaign against real and imaginary political opponents, François Tombalbaye created a special criminal court. He also went on to eliminate Muslim opponents and promoted Southerners, particularly his fellow Sara tribesmen, within the government. By the end of the year 1963, the country's prisons contained the who's who of Chadian politicians. In June 1964, Chad's new National Assembly granted Tombalbaye complete control over all appointments to the political bureau of the PPT, which by then was the sole source of political authority in Chad. Now, with the PPT, government and upper echelons of the civil service now heavily stocked with loyalists and with opposition leaders in prison, François Tombalbaye was in full command of the country. But this was not the worst part of it all, more was to come. François Tombalbaye had somewhat of a noble idea to Africanize the nation of Chad and move it away from colonial relics. With this in mind, he started with Africanizing the civil service and security forces, and this was to be done as rapidly as possible. Between 1960 and 1963, the number of French officials in the central government administration declined from 95 to 30, and by the end of 1962, the entire territorial administrative structure was in Chadian hands. Unfortunately, Africanization was not entirely popular amongst the population of Chad, especially Chad's farmers and herders, despite their deep resentment of the French colonial rule. And this is why. Because of the abrupt purge of French officials, there was a decline in the quality of government service that was immediately apparent. This was in part because of the usual difficulties of such a transition, but also because many of the newly hired and promoted Chadians were less experienced and less adequately trained than their departing French counterparts. Also because the great majority of the country's Western educated and French-speaking citizens were Southerners, to most people in the North, the policy of Africanization often represented to them a Southernization of the Chadian government. What appeared to some observers to be progress in African self-government was perceived by those from the north and central areas to be an increasingly blatant seizure of power by the Southerners. To many in the north and central Chad, the southern Chadians were perceived as simply almost as alien and arrogant in the same way as the departing French. At the same time, François Tombalbaye's failure to establish hiring and training policies geared to achieving greater ethnic and regional balance in public administration was one of his most serious shortcomings. To add insult to injury, another issue that made Tombalbaye increase the discontent amongst the masses was when he imposed an additional tax in 1964 under the pretense of a national loan. This national loan was supposed to fund local industry, but truthfully speaking, the loan was funded by imposing spine-crushing taxes on an already impoverished populace. On top of that action, some government administrators were allegedly forcing citizens in rural areas to make payments at 3 times the official taxation rates. Tombalbaye also failed to properly integrate the central and northern Chadian leaders into the political conversation. These leaders often expressed their dissatisfaction with François Tombalbaye's government in a violent manner, and the response of the government was just as violent. when Muslims rioted in N'Djamena, the capital, in September of 1963 following the arbitrary arrest of 3 Muslim leaders, the government reacted swiftly and repressively. Now, François Tombalbaye really put the foot to the pedal and accelerated the Africanization process in 1973. Chad underwent a cultural revolution called authenticity, and it was largely based on the Africanization policies that had been developed in Mobutu Sese Seko's Zaire. In Chad, African names replaced European titles for people and places. François Tombalbaye himself chose the name Ngata, meaning chief. He was no longer François Tombalbaye, he was now Ngata Tombalbaye. This policy from Tombalbaye, which was also called Chaditude, was there to foster a sense of national pride and identity. He ordered the 4 million citizens of the former French colony to change their foreign first names just like he did. City and street names were also Africanized. The capital, Fort Lamy, was renamed to N'Djamena. Initially, this cultural revolution stirred little controversy and was generally well received. But things soon took a turn for the worse, and this is why. During this process, Ngata Tombalbaye ordered the revival of an ancient pagan tribal custom known as Yondo, which was a grueling initiation rite practiced by his native Sara tribal group of southern Chad. Ngata Tombalbaye had himself gone through this process as an adolescent, and this Yondo ritual is known to involve floggings, facial scarring, being buried alive, drugging, and really grueling endurance tests like crawling naked through a nest of ravenous termites. Some Sara tribesmen who had been raised in the bush did not always survive the ritual, which suggests that it was even more difficult for the urbanized Chadians to endure this ritual as well. President Ngata Tombalbaye even decreed that high government officials, regardless of their religious beliefs, be among the first group of initiates to go through this Yondo ordeal. Well, the Minister of Agriculture objected, stating that the 2-month program would interfere with these efforts to increase farm production in the drought-stricken country. The Education Minister also objected, arguing that the initiation of teachers would interrupt the school schedule. And so a 7-month delay was granted, but just afterwards, 1,000 Chadian officials were sent to the south to the Yondo camps. From mid-1973 to April of 1974, an estimated 3,000 civil servants, including 2 cabinet ministers and 1 colonel, went through the Yondo initiation. Now, because the Yondo rites were perceived as being anti-Christian, resistance to the process exacerbated antagonisms along clan and religious lines in the nation of Chad. These actions created disaffection among civil servants, army officers, and students. People in Chad really resented President Ngata Tombalbaye even more, and all of this soon contributed to his inevitable downfall. As we have since established, Ngata Tombalbaye openly discriminated against the northern and central regions of Chad and established a repressive regime that contributed to Chad's fragmentation during his 15-year tenure as president. Major regional rifts started emerging in Chad, and they were further complicated by intra-regional divisions, especially in the north, where numerous warlords started to emerge. These warlords each had an ethnic-based following, and they attempted to overthrow Tombalbaye's regime. In 1966, these northern rebels would unite to become a force known as Frolinat. Frolinat established bases in Sudan and received assistance from Algeria and Libya. To make matters worse, after Colonel Muammar Gaddafi seized power in Libya in 1969, he went on to exploit the political instability in Chad by stationing troops in northern Chad and by channeling support to the various Chadian insurgents. This made President François Tombalbaye expel Libyan diplomats in 1971, blaming them for inciting a coup attempt and inspiring unrest within Chad. Despite this though, in general, François Tombalbaye often sought a balance between concessions and resistance to Muammar Gaddafi's regional designs, hoping to persuade Gaddafi to reduce his support for these Chadian insurgents. As a way to indicate that he didn't want to cause trouble for Muammar Gaddafi, François Tombalbaye often voiced a willingness to cede a territory called the Azores Strip to Libya and did not object to Libyan troops being stationed there after 1973. However, the people of Chad generally did not like this setup between Tombalbaye and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, and all of these actions did lead to Ngata Tombalbaye's popularity amongst the masses. Across the nation of Chad, there soon erupted renewed protests against Ngata Tombalbaye's unpopular and weakened regime. By the mid-1970s, Ngata Tombalbaye faced armed opposition in all parts of the country. During his 15 years of harsh and eccentric rule, President Ngata Tombalbaye had survived at least 7 major assassination attempts. Early in the year 1975, a few months before his death, a former head of the PPT's women's wing was tried for attempting to kill Ngata Tombalbaye by witchcraft. This lady allegedly hired wizards to pierce the eyes of a black sheep symbolizing Tombalbaye and bury it alive. Ngata Tombalbaye was finally ousted in a coup d'etat. On April 13, 1975, following a rumor of renewed purges in the army, junior officers from the south effected this coup. In a surprise sunrise attack, uniformed soldiers and police stormed the white-walled presidential palace in N'Djamena. François Ngata Tombalbaye was either killed in crossfire or possibly summarily executed. This marked the end of François Ngata Tombalbaye's turbulent 15-year rule of the nation of Chad. Since gaining independence, the nation of Chad has seen one brutal despot after another, and one of them was Hissène Habré, who seized power by force in 1982 and quickly became the architect of terrible repression in the Central African nation. The United States and France supported Habre's regime as a bulwark against Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who wanted to expand Libya's territory into northern Chad. Under President Ronald Reagan of the United States, the CIA gave support to help Habre take power and then provided his government with massive military aid. The period when Habre was in charge of Chad was marked by terrible repression, whereby opponents were arrested by his special police, tortured and often executed, including 4,000 who were identified by name. Hissène Habré came from the most humble beginnings. He was born on 13 August 1942 into a family of shepherds in Chad's vast northern desert. He might never have left his local town had it not been for the French colonial administration, who recognized his youthful brilliance and sent him to elite universities in Paris. There in Paris, Hissène Habré studied Marxism, mingled with other up-and-coming African students, and was introduced to revolutionary politics. Around this time, Hissène Habré developed a fascination for the revolutionary Che Guevara and came to think of then Chad's president, a Christian from the south named François Ngata Tombalbaye, as no more than a French puppet. The context here was that France, from its time as Chad's colonial overlord, favored the more fertile, cotton-producing southern part of Chad, known as Useful Chad, over what they deemed as the dry, useless Chad of Muslim herders and nomads in the north, where Hissène Habré came from. Young Habré returned home in 1971 and dedicated himself to building a desert militia, which he viewed as a power base for his much broader future ambitions. People who knew Hissène Habré from that time say that he really had a burning desire inside to conquer power. Hissène Habré's rise did not seem driven by ideology. In fact, many years later, a report from a truth commission set up in Chad sharply criticized Hissène Habré's opportunism. In this report, Habré was described as a man without scruples, motivated by power alone. He would join with the armed rebellion in Chad for one moment and with the government the next. Anyways, as he was moving from oasis to oasis in the desert, Hissène Habré galvanized the remote and neglected northern tribes with calls for rebellion. By the time he was 31, Hissène Habré had put together a ragtag army of several hundred men. Just like his desire to grab power, Habré also yearned to attract widespread attention to himself and his burgeoning movement. His chance to be in the limelight came in 1974 when his troops captured a French archaeologist by the name François Closter, who was exploiting pre-Islamic tombs in the desert. Thereafter, Habré and his troops demanded a huge ransom to release this French archaeologist. When a high-ranking French hostage negotiator arrived, he too was taken prisoner and later hanged. For close to 3 years, the French government refused to negotiate with Habré even after Closter's husband traveled to the region and ended up a captive himself. In this case, the French had adopted the stance of not caving to the demands of kidnappers and terrorists. Only after when French TV showed François Closter breaking down into tears in Hissène Habré's desert camp and having accused the French government of forgetting her, did the then French President Valéry put in steps to secure her release. The intermediary whom the French president worked with was none other than Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, Chad's northern neighbor. Muammar Gaddafi had been supporting the rebels at the time. François Closter was finally freed, but Hissène Habré had achieved his goal. He was now known as a force to be reckoned with. In 1973, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi sent troops into the Azur Strip, claiming that it rightfully belonged to Libya on the basis of an unratified agreement between France and Italy in 1935. Muammar Gaddafi then built an airbase at Azur, set up a civil administration, and issued maps showing the Strip as Libya's sovereign territory. Gaddafi then used the Strip as a forward base for deeper involvement in Chad. However, his occupation of the Azur Strip caused a deep rift among the northerners in Chad. One faction was led by Goukouni Ouédi, who was willing to accept Libyan involvement. Another faction, which was led by Hissène Habré, adamantly opposed Muammar Gaddafi. This meant that Goukouni Ouédi and Hissène Habré became rivals, and their rivalry plunged the nation of Chad into prolonged conflict. With the backing of Muammar Gaddafi, Goukouni Ouédi succeeded in ousting Habré from northern Chad and moved his forces southwards. In eastern Chad, meanwhile, Muammar Gaddafi supported a second insurgent group known as the Volcan Army. In a joint offensive in 1978, Goukouni Ouédi's forces and the Volcan Army made a rapid thrust towards N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. The person who was leading Chad at that time, General Malloum, then called for help from the nation of France in order to fight these forces. As a result, 1,000 French troops and combat aircraft were thrown into battle and routed the rebel forces on the road to N'Djamena. In the aftermath of the 1978 clashes, a new alliance was formed between General Malloum and Hissène Habré, thereby giving northerners a prominent role in the government of Chad for the first time. Since his defeat in the north, Hissène Habré had regrouped in eastern Chad, raised a new army with support from Sudan, and established a strong enough position in negotiations with General Malloum to obtain the post of Prime Minister in a new government of national unity. However, Hissène Habré soon turned on General Malloum. In February of 1979, in what became known as the First Battle of N'Djamena, Hissène Habré's forces and Malloum's national army fought for supremacy, precipitating communal violence between northerners and southerners in which thousands died. Encouraged by their leaders, southerners fled en masse southwards, leaving the administration in N'Djamena to collapse. As the cycle of revenge continued, thousands of Muslim traders in the south were killed. At a national level, Chad had no government at all. After 4 international peace conferences to try and remedy this state of affairs, Goukouni Ouédi took over as president and Hissène Habré became the Minister of Defense. Goukouni Ouédi was made president as he was regarded as a man of integrity who commanded the respect necessary to unite Chad's bitterly divided tribal factions. But it wasn't long before Hissène Habré blew up the fragile peace, triggering a civil war that lasted 9 months and devastated the capital N'Djamena. Half the population fled into neighboring Cameroon, leaving N'Djamena as a ghost city. Finally, in December of 1980, Libyan troops backed by tanks, heavy artillery, and units of the Islamic Legion combined with Goukouni Ouédi's forces to drive Hissène Habré's fighters out of the capital, forcing Habré to seek refuge in Sudan. On the day of Habré's flight, neighbors and international news reporters found at least 50 dead bodies outside his house in N'Djamena, many of them with bound hands and feet. If anyone had been in doubt previously, this discovery had cemented Hissène Habré's reputation as a brutal man. Many people in Chad detested him for what he had done. The election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1980 would change Hissène Habré's fortunes dramatically. Ronald Reagan saw Goukouni Ouédi as a stooge of Muammar Gaddafi, overlooking the fact that Libya at one time or another had backed all 11 Chadian armed factions, including that of Hissène Habré. President Reagan was encouraged in that view by members of his CIA and other members of the United States National Security Establishment, who saw the Libyan troops stationed in northern Chad as a point of weakness of Gaddafi, whom Ronald Reagan liked to call the mad dog of the Middle East. Ronald Reagan and his security advisors were of the idea that if they could only find an effective ally on the ground in Chad, then they had a golden opportunity to strike a heavy blow to Muammar Gaddafi and his forces in northern Chad. So, soon after his inauguration, Ronald Reagan signed a secret presidential order to chase Muammar Gaddafi out of Chad. Ronald Reagan and his CIA became so invested in Hissène Habré, in fact, that even after Goukouni Weidi had Libyan forces withdraw from Chad in October of 1981, they continued to send massive quantities of cash, armaments and vehicles to Habré through the nations of Egypt and Sudan. This support paved the way for Hissène Habré to march on to N'Djamena and claim power in June of 1982. The Organization of African Unity had peacekeeping troops in N'Djamena that were funded in part by the United States, but they put up no resistance to Hissène Habré's forces. And so that month of 1982, Hissène Habré became the leader of Chad. President Hissène Habré was not your typical African dictator. He didn't wear military fatigues as styled by Idi Amin and Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, nor did he have the pomp and flair of Mobutu Sese Seko. The new president of Chad could even appear timid in public. To win over public sympathy, he portrayed himself by turns as a convinced Maoist and also as a fervent Muslim. Once he was in power, Hissène Habré established single-party rule, outlawed the opposition and encouraged a cult of personality. His image found its way onto t-shirts and he organized regular parades in his honor. Hissène Habré's speeches were filled with anti-colonialist rhetoric, and he also cast himself as a populist fighter pushing back against the pressures of the West. The reality on the ground, however, was that he maintained power only by serving as a proxy for the United States and, more inconsistently, French interests in the region. In return, the United States and to a certain extent the French were more than willing to turn a blind eye to the brutality with which he ran the show in Chad. The CIA in some reports even dubbed him as a moderate northerner striving to overcome his reputation for ruthlessness and opportunism. In truth, Hissène Habré's ruthlessness and brutality never subsided. In fact, it intensified. Aware that his regime was under threat from Libya and even other opposition forces in Chad, Hissène Habré created his security service known as the Directorate of Documentation and Security, the DDS, not long after becoming president. With the establishment of the DDS, Hissène Habré had what he called his eyes and ears to spy on the population, crack down on dissent and enforce loyalty through fear and division. Documents that were left behind by the DDS after Hissène Habré had been deposed highlight the extent to which Habré oversaw its day-to-day operations. Hissène Habré was kept informed of virtually everything to do with the DDS, from the cloth being used for uniforms as well as the deaths of prisoners. President Habré also had 7 secret prisons built, including a dungeon on the grounds of the presidential palace. Almost as soon as he came to power, he was at war with the South, where opposition to him was strongest. And so Hissène Habré ordered the arrest and execution of educated Chadians from the southern cities, civil servants, teachers, businessmen, intellectuals, in the belief that such a purge was his best protection against an uprising. The list of offenses meriting arrest including speaking ill of Hissène Habré, listening to enemy radio stations, or performing magical rites to aid the enemy. In September of 1984, Hissène Habré induced hundreds of former southern fighters to attend a ceremony at a rural farm, where they were to lay down their arms and be incorporated into the national army. But instead, they were slaughtered along with their families in an incident that kicked off what came to be known as the Black September. One of Hissène Habré's most loyal commanders, Idriss Déby, who later became the president of Chad, was put in charge of enforcing the Black September. In Hissène Habré's Chad, torture was the rule, not the exception, especially when it came to interrogating prisoners. One infamous method was known as the abatacha, and it involved tying all 4 limbs behind a prisoner's back. Other prisoners were subjected to water torture. I'm not going to go into further gruesome details. Ruling a country like Chad with hundreds of ethnic groups required flexibility as well as ruthlessness, and Hissène Habré would periodically strike deals with ethnic leaders, rebel movements, and banned political parties to bring them into his fold. Ultimately though, Hissène Habré didn't trust anyone, particularly if they were not from his own small desert Goran clan. Each of the 4 DDS directors who served under him were from his Goran clan, with the last one of them being his nephew. Goukouni Weidi, who was still considered by many African states to be the legitimate president of Chad, posed a separate problem for Habre in the north. In 1983, he installed a rival government in Habre's own home turf and convinced the Libyans to send troops once again to support him. That in turn set off alarm bells not only in the United States but also within the French government. And so in response, the Reagan administration now made its assistance to Hissène Habré open to the public, initiating massive transfers of aircraft, trucks, jeeps, rifles, machine guns, and even missiles. The French ramped up their support too, sending mercenaries trained by their secret service to fight alongside Hissène Habré. Israel, Egypt, Sudan, and Zaire provided training and equipment of their own. All of these nations saw Muammar Gaddafi as the more consequential enemy and were worried about the havoc that he would wreak across Africa and the Middle East if he was left unchecked. They were not concerned about Hissène Habré's brutality. Saddam Hussein of Iraq was perhaps the most indulgent supporter of all, giving Hissène Habré a briefcase with $1 million and a promise of a similar sum each year. This money was meant for Hissène Habré's personal upkeep. With this abundance of outside support, Hissène Habré defeated Goukouni Weidi and the Libyans on 30 July 1983. Habré's troops took between 1,000 and 2,000 prisoners and killed 200 others, including 7 ministers in Goukouni Weidi's shadow government. Several weeks after this operation, the nation of France sent 3,000 troops under an operation called Operation Manta, the largest French military undertaking since the Algerian War. This operation was soon followed by Operation Epervier, in which the French air unit provided cover for Hissène Habré in N'Djamena. The fighting would rage on and off for the next 4 years until Hissène Habré reconquered the north of Chad once and for all in March of 1987. As time went on, Hissène Habré started becoming more and more paranoid. For example, in 1989, he accused 3 senior government officials representing another group of allies, the Zagawa, of plotting a coup d'etat against him. One of these officials was the head of the army, one was the Minister of Interior, and the third was Idriss Déby, a top military advisor who had been army chief during the Black September. Immediately, Idriss Déby managed to escape to Sudan, but the other 2 were arrested, tortured, and killed. Hissène Habré then took out his wrath on the entire Zagawa clan, razing villages and imprisoning and torturing hundreds of people. However, opposition to Habré in Chad also started intensifying. For example, in 1990, a group of intellectuals, including former government ministers, secretly distributed anti-Habré flyers at army barracks, schools, and factories around the capital. Something like this had never happened before, and it drove Hissène Habré crazy. One by one, Hissène Habré had the drafters arrested and tortured, supervising their interrogations personally. Meanwhile, in exile, Idriss Déby gave the Libyans detailed information about CIA operations in Chad. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi offered Idriss Déby military aid to seize power in Chad in exchange for Libyan prisoners of war. Idriss Déby then relocated to Sudan in 1989 and formed the Patriotic Salvation Movement, an insurgent group supported by Libya and Sudan. This group started operations against Hissène Habré. Also by this point, the French were out of the Habré business. The French had become frustrated by Hissène Habré's refusal to tell them what he and the Americans were doing with a contingent of captured Libyan soldiers. The soldiers were in fact being trained as secret anti-Gaddafi Contras. The United States, by contrast, remained fully committed, sending Hissène Habré the positions of Idriss Déby's advancing troops as they sped across the flat, barren middle of the country in machine gun-mounted Toyota pickup trucks. The Americans also made arrangements to fly weapons, ammunition, and other material on military transport planes so that Hissène Habré could defend the capital in N'Djamena. However, the sheer speed of Idriss Déby's forces beat them to it. Against all odds, Hissène Habré was overthrown. The night before his overthrow, Habré set about looting what remained of the national treasury, telling the central bank he needed the money to buy more weapons and defend the capital. N'Djamena fell to Déby's forces the next day. Afterwards, Hissène Habré crossed the Chari River into Cameroon. He then fled to Senegal, taking about $12 million from the national bank accounts with him. Idriss Déby's takeover of the government of Chad was not without resistance. In 1991 and 1992, there were several attacks and coup attempts by opposition forces, many of whom were still aligned with Hissène Habré, but Déby maintained his grip on the government and the country. The horrors of Hissène Habré's rule, the torture, starvation, and mass graves soon became apparent to all. Idriss Déby set up a truth commission to investigate, in the name of peace and justice, his predecessors' crimes. This is when the full picture of the brutality started to emerge. For many years, Hissène Habré lived quietly in coastal Dakar, Senegal, buying properties there and remaining untroubled by the government of Abdoulaye Wade, which kept delaying his prosecution. Hissène Habré lived in Dakar, guarded by 2 security agents, and was seen occasionally at the local mosque for Friday prayers. It was the government of Wade's successor that tried Hissène Habré, setting up a special court with the African Union to do so. Hissène Habré faced charges regarding politically motivated killings and acts of torture allegedly committed during his rule in Chad. In May of 2016, Hissène Habré was found guilty by an international tribunal in Senegal of human rights abuses, including rape, sexual slavery, and ordering the killing of 40,000 people. He was sentenced to life in prison. When Hissène Habré was convicted, his victims rejoiced, punched the air, cried, and ululated in the court. They had fought for justice for decades. Hissène Habré died on 24 August 2021 after testing positive for COVID-19. On 20 April 2021, news emerged that Idriss Déby, the longtime leader of the country of Chad, had died after he had gone to the front line to visit his troops that were battling rebels there. In his 30 years as Chad's president, Idriss Déby emerged as one of Africa's wiliest political survivors, holding on to power through rebellions that reached as far as his palace gates, and he established himself as a key military ally of Western powers. As a military commander and as president, Idriss Déby was feared, and people say that he had an aura about him that meant that they did not want to mess with him, and he never hesitated to crack down whenever there was some kind of threat. Since gaining independence from France on the 11th of August 1960, the nation of Chad has known few periods of real peace. A long-running civil war from 1966 to 1979, several invasions by Libya, and rebel movements in different regions ripped apart the country for decades. The division between the country's north, populated by Muslims, and the south, largely inhabited by Christians, was reinforced by France when it colonized the country. During the period of colonization, the French favored the south and reversed the historic domination of the north. Chad elected its first president in 1960, and his name was François Tombalbaye, the leader of the Chadian Progressive Party. 2 years later, Tombalbaye turned the country into a one-party state and became increasingly authoritarian, provoking great resentment with his insensitive policies towards the Muslim north. In 1979, the rebels captured the capital of the nation, N'Djamena, and overthrew the southern-dominated regime. Afterwards, the rebel leaders then fought amongst themselves, and this civil war lasted for 3 years. One of the rebel commanders, Hissène Habré, seized control of the country in 1982 and began 8 years of tyrannical rule marked by conflict with Libya, support from France and the United States, as well as widespread atrocities and human rights violations. In 1990, Hissène Habré was overthrown by his former chief military advisor, Idriss Déby Itno, who is the main subject of this video. Idriss Déby was born in Bedoba, a remote northeastern desert village in what was then French Equatorial Africa, into a family of the Zagawa ethnic group. He was the son of poor herders who scraped a living from the desert. In the early 1970s, while the country was in the grips of the long-running civil war, Idriss Déby joined the army. Young Idriss then went to France in 1976 to receive additional training at a flight school and earned a pilot's license. It is said that Idriss Déby could decipher Morse code, the language used to send messages over long distances. On occasion, he would help his classmates to get through the coding exams at school. According to the testimonies of the time, Idriss Déby was described as a calm and discreet student who would motivate his fellow students during physical exercises. Some of his friends at the time even described him as being a complete athlete who was always the first person on the obstacle course. In 1978, Déby returned to Chad, which was still in a state of conflict. When Idriss Déby returned to Chad, the nation was in the middle of the civil war that I spoke about earlier. He immediately joined Hissène Habré, the notorious warlord and fellow northerner. Together they created an alliance between Idriss Déby's tribe, the Zagawa, and Habre's tribe, the Daza. On the 7th of June 1982, the rebels entered N'Djamena with Hissène Habré and Idriss Déby side by side. Together they toppled the president Gukoni Wedei and Hissène Habré took power. As a reward for his support, Habré made Idriss Déby his deputy army chief. 2 years later, it was under Idriss Déby's authority that the repression in the south, known as the Black September, was carried out. The aim of this repression was to subdue the Southerners. In the Black September of 1984, villages were attacked, burned and destroyed. By that time, Idriss Déby was recognized as a brilliant military strategist and was made commander-in-chief of the armed forces. However, he was becoming too popular and powerful for Hissène Habré's liking, and Habré decided to get him out of the way by sending him on a higher officer's education training course in Paris, France. When Idriss Déby returned to Chad, Hissène Habré made him his military advisor. As Habré entrenched his power, he spread offices and positions among his own Daza tribe and so became less dependent upon Idriss Déby and his Zagawa tribe. Déby saw his influence waning, but he failed to create a government power base of his own. His relationship with Habré further soured when, on the 1st of April 1989, he was accused of plotting against Hissène Habré. At this moment in time, Idriss Déby realized that his days were numbered and so he had to do something about it. With his loyal troops, Déby fought his way clear of N'Djamena and retreated to Sudan, where he went into exile in the Darfur region. Unfortunately, his colleague Hassan Jammers was captured and killed. Idriss Déby soon visited Lagos, Nigeria, where he spread the news of Habre's government, tribalism, extortion and injustice. As he was garnering support for his movement, he went to Libya to brief Muammar Gaddafi on Hissène Habré's plans and troop dispositions. With encouragement from the Libyan leader, Idriss Déby then created his Patriotic Salvation Movement, and in March of 1990, Déby's forces engaged with Hissène Habré's troops in a number of fierce battles. In November of the same year, with assistance from Libya and France, Déby crossed the border into Chad with his full force and again engaged Habré's forces in battle. Idriss Déby's forces took only 2 weeks to reach N'Djamena, and Habré, whose forces had collapsed, fled the country. It is important to note that in this instance, even though France and Libya were enemies, they supported Déby because they had a common interest in toppling Habré, whose proximity to the United States they equally saw as a threat. Paris considered the United States a rival trying to set foot in its African backyard. Almost 3 decades after Hissène Habré fled Chad, a special court in Senegal convicted him of atrocities committed during his presidency. Without the support of Idriss Déby, it would have never been possible to prosecute Habré, who was eventually convicted in 2016. Upon taking power, Idriss Déby abolished Hissène Habré's one-party system and started to put in motion a process to have regular multi-party elections. So in this regard, a national conference was held in 1993 to establish a transitional government, and Idriss Déby was officially designated the interim president. His regime then became the first in Chad's history to hold elections, and the first elections were held in 1996. However, the results of these elections were contested by both the opposition, civil society, and international NGOs, and it is widely believed that these elections were rigged with French support. It is said that the French government wanted Idriss Déby to remain in power whatever the results of the vote were. When Idriss Déby was re-elected in 2001, it was again amid allegations of widespread voting irregularities. A 2005 constitutional referendum that eliminated presidential term limits was denounced by critics as another means of supporting the president's increasingly autocratic rule. Nonetheless, the referendum passed, clearing the way for Idriss Déby's election in 2006 in elections that were boycotted by most of the opposition. Throughout his presidency, Idriss Déby repeatedly faced resistance in the form of coup attempts and rebel activity. The rebellions that Idriss Déby faced during his time in power were stoked by disputes over the exploitation of oil, as well as rival regional factions. Fighting raged in N'Djamena following an attempted coup against Idriss Déby in 2006. In this attempt, a group of soldiers had been plotting to shoot down Idriss Déby's plane, but fortunately for him, this plan was foiled. He and his administration were beset with charges of corruption and were known for brutally repressing individual rights and freedoms, with Chadian security forces routinely committing serious human rights violations. Also in 2003, the nation of Chad was drawn into the Sudanese civil war, and as a result, violent conflict was spilling over into Chad. Idriss Déby accused Omar al-Bashir of having fomented unrest inside of Chad in an effort to destabilize the country. From 2005 to 2010, various militias attacked villages and cities in eastern Chad. Eventually, in the year 2010, Chad and Sudan signed a peace agreement, putting an end to their proxy wars. In an alternate universe, Idriss Déby's rule might have been one of prosperity for the people of Chad. The country's vast deserts cover untapped reserves of uranium, as well as oil that currently generates much of the country's revenue. Unfortunately, under the Déby regime, Chad frequently featured in the lists of the world's poorest and most corrupt countries, and critics accused Déby of squandering the oil wealth by pouring it into the military, which he used to repress his critics. In turn, this really enabled him to hold on to power for long. In the year 2000, the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation agreed to back a $3.5 billion oil venture in Chad. This venture was meant to be a flagship project to demonstrate that oil revenues for the greater good of a nation's populace. But things started to go bad when Idriss Déby immediately began to divert the oil money to the military. Initially, Déby's government had agreed to an innovative mechanism designed to ensure that the oil revenues went to priority sectors like health, education, and water supplies for the desert nation. However, once the crude oil started flowing, Idriss Déby simply added security to the list of priorities, allowing the oil money to slosh into the coffers of the army. In 2004, the economy of the country grew by 30% thanks to the start of the oil production, but unfortunately, the overwhelming beneficiary of this was Idriss Déby. His kleptocracy was also known for its nepotism. Of his many known children, Idriss Déby made 5 into army generals and raised another 6 of his children to the rank of army colonel. He further appointed his children to the most sensitive and lucrative portfolios, with one becoming an intelligence chief. Idriss Déby made his eldest brother, Dawusa Déby Itno, the Minister of Post, and the youngest of his male siblings was Chad's customs chief. His nephew held the job of head of military intelligence. Despite all the negatives that we have covered thus far, and despite Idriss Déby's shortcomings on the domestic front, you can't take away from the fact that during the time that he was in power, few sub-Saharan African countries had the regional reach of Chad, and this was due essentially to its army. The army that Idriss Déby built became one of the most effective armies in sub-Saharan Africa And so in the years after 2011, Idriss Déby bolstered his international standing with his army's leadership in efforts to counter the spread of terrorism that was being perpetrated by Islamic militant groups in the region. Chad became a linchpin in the struggle against jihadist groups in the Lake Chad Basin, where it intervened after 2014 at the request of its Nigerian and Cameroonian neighbors to fight against Boko Haram factions. Idriss Déby's army was in the past also involved in some neighboring civil wars, notably those in Sudan and the Central African Republic, and more indirectly in Libya. So in essence, Idriss Déby became a stabilizing factor in the region, and in the long run, his death might create a dangerous vacuum in the region. Only time will tell. In May of 2018, Idriss Déby expanded his presidential power when a new constitution was brought into play. The post of Prime Minister was eliminated, and so the executive power was concentrated with the president. Among the changes made under the new constitution was a change to the presidential terms. Idriss Déby now had the option to stand in the next two presidential elections, potentially remaining in office until the year 2033. So unsurprisingly, he did choose to stand in the elections that were held early in 2021. On 11 April 2021, as the country went to the polls to vote in the presidential election, a rebel group began an assault from the northern regions of Chad. Meanwhile, the provisional election results that were announced on the 19th of April showed that Idriss Déby had been re-elected. But as fate would have it, the next day the military announced that Idriss Déby had been killed after battling with rebels on the front lines of conflict. As you have probably gathered by now, based on some of the footage that I've used in this video, Idriss Déby frequently cast himself as a wartime leader, and he would often wear military fatigues and pay visits to soldiers on the battlefront. So it came as no surprise to hear that Idriss Déby died on the front line, as many people described him as being incredibly hands-on, often going to take charge in battle if he felt that his commanders were not in control. So Idriss Déby was killed on the front line on 20 April 2021, and this brought to end his 3 decades at the helm of the nation of Chad. Let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are about Idriss Déby and his regime. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.